Hello. We're back to read some more Federalist papers. So today we're going to do 54 through 58 is what I'm planning on. So last time we were reading about the structure of the proposed government, and we got into the House of Representatives, and that's where we are now. So he was talking about kind of the requirements to be elected to the House of Representatives, and now we're going to go even more into it. I don't think we're going to get to the Senate today. Let me check my physical copy. Yeah, we don't get to the Senate until 62. So we still got a little ways to go. But yeah, so I've been reading a book, in my spare time, as I do, about Heidegger, the German philosopher, and things get very it's very metaphysical, I guess would be the word. It's not very concrete, the things he talks about. So it's going to be kind of funny to go back to this where it's talking about like actual real stuff and not transcendental phenomenology. But anyway, so we're on 54, the apportionment of members among the states, from the New York Packet, Tuesday, February 12th, 1788. This is James Madison still. To the people of the state of New York. The next view which I shall take of the House of Representatives relates to the appointment of its members to the several states, of which is to be determined by the same rule with that of direct taxes. It is not contended that the number of people in each state ought not to be the standard for regulating the proportion of those who are to represent the people of each state. The establishment of the same rule for the appointment of taxes will probably be as little contested, though the rule itself in this case is by no means founded on the same principle. In the former case, the rule is understood to refer to the personal rights of the people, with which it has a natural and universal connection. In the latter, it has reference to the proportion of wealth, of which it is in no case a precise measure, and in ordinary cases a very unfit one. But notwithstanding the imperfection of the rule as applied to the relative wealth and contributions of the states, it is evidently the least objectionable among the practicable rules, and had too recently obtained the general sanction of America not to have found a ready preference with the convention. All this is admitted, it will perhaps be said, but does it follow from an admission of numbers for the measure of representation, or of slaves combined with free citizens as a ratio of taxation, that slaves ought to be included in the numerical rule of representation? Slaves are considered as property, not as persons. They ought therefore to be comprehended in estimates of taxation which are founded on property, and to be excluded from representation, which is regulated by a census of persons. This is the objection, as I understand it, stated in its full force. I shall be equally candid in stating the reasoning which may be offered on the opposite side. We subscribe to the doctrine, might one of our Southern brethren observe, that representation relates more immediately to persons and taxation more immediately to property, and we join in the application of this distinction to the case of our slaves. But we must deny the fact that slaves are considered merely as property, and in no respect whatever as persons. The true state of the case is that they partake of both these qualities, being considered by our laws in some respects as persons, and in other respects as property, in being compelled to labor not for himself but for a master, in being vendible by one master to another master, and in being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body by the capricious will of another. The slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property. In being protected, on the one hand, in his life and in his limbs, against the violence of all others, even the master of his labor and his liberty, and in being punishable himself for all violence committed against others, the slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of the society, not as a part of the irrational creation, as a moral person, not as a mere article of property. The federal Constitution, therefore, decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves, when it views them in the mixed character of persons and of property. This is, in fact, their true character. It is the character bestowed on them by the laws under which they live, and it will not be denied that these are the proper criterion, because it is only under the pretext that the laws have transformed the Negroes into subjects of property that a place is disputed them in the computation of numbers, and it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have been taken away, the Negroes can no longer be refused an equal share of representation with the other inhabitants. The question may be placed in another light. It is agreed on all sides that numbers are the best scale of wealth and taxation, and they are only proper, and they are, as they are, the only proper scale of representation. Would the convention have been impartial or consistent if they had rejected the slaves from the list of inhabitants when the shares of representation were to be calculated, and inserted them on the lists when the tariff of contributions was to be adjusted? Could it be reasonably expected that the Southern states would concur in a system which considered their slaves in some degree as men when burdens were to be imposed, but refused to consider them in the same light when advantages were to be conferred? Might not some surprise also be expressed that those who reproached the Southern states for the barbarous policy of considering as property a part of their human brethren should themselves contend that the government to which all the states are to be parties ought to consider this unfortunate race more completely in the unnatural light of property than the very laws of which they complain? It may be replied, perhaps, that slaves are not included in the estimate of representatives in any of the states possessing them. They neither vote themselves nor increase the votes of their masters. Upon what principle, then, ought they be taken into the federal estimate of representation? In rejecting them altogether, the Constitution would, in this respect, have followed the very laws which have been appealed to as the proper guide. This objection is repelled by a single observation. It is a fundamental principle of the proposed Constitution that the aggregate number of representatives allotted to the several states is to be determined by a federal rule, founded on the aggregate number of inhabitants. So the right of choosing this allotted number in each state is to be exercised by such part of the inhabitants as the state itself may designate. The qualifications on which the right of suffrage depend are not, perhaps, the same in any two states. In some of the states, the difference is very material. In every state, a certain proportion of inhabitants are deprived of this right by the constitution of the state, who will be included in the census by which the federal Constitution apportions the representatives. In this point of view, the Southern states might retort the complaint by insisting that the principle laid down by the convention required that no regard should be had to the policy of particular states towards their own inhabitants, and consequently that the slaves, as inhabitants, should have been admitted into the census according to their full number, in like manner with other inhabitants, who, by the policy of other states, are not admitted to all the rights of citizens. A rigorous adherence, however, to this principle is waived by those who would be gainers by it. All that they ask is that equal moderation be shown on the other side. Let the case of the slaves be considered, as it is in truth a peculiar one. Let the compromising expedient of the Constitution be mutually adopted, which regards them as inhabitants, but as debased by servitude below the equal level of free inhabitants, which regards the slave as divested of 2/5 of the man. After all, may not another ground be taken on which this article of the Constitution will admit of a still more ready defense? We have hitherto proceeded on the idea that representation related to persons only, and not at all to property. But is it a just idea? Government is instituted no less for protection of the property than of the persons of individuals. The one as well as the other, therefore, may be considered as represented by those who are charged with the government. Upon this principle it is that in several of the states, and particularly in the state of New York, one branch of the government is intended more especially to be the guardian of property, It is accordingly elected by that part of the society which is most interested in this object of government. In the federal constitution, this policy does not prevail. The rights of property are committed into the same hands with the personal rights. Some attention ought, therefore, to be paid to property in the choice of those hands. For another reason, the votes allowed in the federal legislature to the people of each state ought to bear some proportion to the comparative wealth of the states. States have not, like individuals, an influence over each other, arising from superior advantages of fortune. If the law allows an opulent citizen but a single vote in the choice of his representative, the respect and consequence which he derives from his fortunate situation very frequently guide the votes of others to the objects of his choice, and through this imperceptible channel, the rights of property are conveyed into the public representation. A state possesses no such influence over other states. It is not probable that the richest state in the Confederacy will ever influence the choice of a single representative in any other state. Nor will the representatives of the larger and richer states possess any other advantage in the federal legislature over the representatives of other states, though it may result from their superior number alone. As far, therefore, as their superior wealth and weight may justly entitle them to any advantage, it ought to be secured to them by a superior share of representation. The new Constitution is, in this respect, materially different from the existing Confederation, as well as from that of the United Netherlands and other similar confederacies. In each of the latter, the efficacy of the federal resolutions depends on the subsequent and voluntary resolutions of the states composing the Union. Hence the states, though possessing an equal vote in the public councils, have an unequal influence, corresponding with the unequal importance of these subsequent and voluntary resolutions. Under the proposed Constitution, the federal acts will take effect without the necessary intervention of the individual states. They will depend merely on the majority of votes in the federal legislature, and consequently each vote, whether proceeding from a larger or smaller state, or a state more or less wealthy or powerful, will have an equal weight and efficacy, in the same manner as the votes individually given in a state legislature by the representatives of unequal counties or other districts have each a precise equality of value and effect, or if there be any difference in the case, it proceeds from the difference in the personal character of the individual representative, rather than from any regard to the extent of the district from which he comes. Such is the reasoning which an advocate for the Southern interests might employ on this subject, and although it may appear to be a little strained in some points, yet, on the whole, I must confess that it fully reconciles me to the scale of representation which the Convention have established. In one respect, the establishment of a common measure for representation and taxation will have a very salutary effect, as the accuracy of the census to be obtained by the Congress will necessarily depend in a considerable degree on the disposition, if not on the cooperation of the states. It is of great importance that the states should feel as little bias as possible to swell or to reduce the amount of their numbers. Were their share of representation alone to be governed by this rule, they would have an interest in exaggerating their inhabitants. Were the rule to decide their share of taxation alone, a contrary temptation would prevail. By extending the rule to both objects, the states will have opposite interests, which will control and balance each other and produce the requisite impartiality. Publius. So that gives you kind of like an interesting perspective on slavery at the time and how it was handled when setting up the government. You know, the famous 3/5 compromise. He gives the background of that here. So it's an interesting topic. People don't like to talk about it, but it was there. It happened. Yeah, I know the word Negro is considered offensive by some people nowadays. I'm not really sure why, but obviously it's in the text and it has a historical context. So I will read whatever is here. All right, that one was pretty short. But you can definitely see the issues even back then that slavery was bringing. The tensions that were building between the North and the South, because the South, it wasn't as populated. It was mostly farms and plantations, so they had a large slave population, but not very many, voting citizens. But they still had to, house these people, I guess. All right, number 55, the total number of the House of Representatives. For the Independent Journal, Wednesday, February 13th, 1788. This is James Madison. To the people of the state of New York. The number of which the House of Representatives is to consist forms another and a very interesting point of view, under which this branch of the federal legislature may be contemplated. Scarce any article, indeed, in the whole Constitution seems to be rendered more worthy of attention by the weight of character and the apparent force of argument with which it has been assailed. The charges exhibited against it are, first, that so small a number of representatives will be an unsafe depositary of the public interest. Secondly, that they will not possess a proper knowledge of the local circumstances of their numerous constituents. Thirdly, that they will be taken from that class of citizens which will sympathize least with the feelings of the mass of the people, and be most likely to aim at a permanent elevation of the few on the depression of the many. Fourthly, that defective as the number will be in the first instance, it will be more and more disproportionate by the increase of the people and the obstacles which will prevent a correspondent increase of the representatives. In general, it may be remarked on this subject that no political problem is less susceptible of a precise solution than that which relates to the number most convenient for a representative legislature, nor is there any point on which the policy of the several states is more at variance, whether we compare their legislative assemblies directly with each other, or consider the proportions which they respectively bear to the number of their constituents. Passing over the difference between the smallest and largest states as Delaware, whose most numerous branch consists of 21 representatives, in Massachusetts, where it amounts to between 300 and 400, a very considerable difference is observable among states nearly equal in population. The number of representatives in Pennsylvania is not more than 1/5 of that in the state last mentioned. New York, whose population is to that of South Carolina as 6 to 5, has little more than 1/3 of the number of representatives. As great a disparity prevails between the states of Georgia and Delaware or Rhode Island, in Pennsylvania, the representatives do not bear a greater proportion to their constituents than of 1 for every 4 or 5,000. In Rhode Island, they bear a proportion of at least 1 for every 1,000. And according to the Constitution of Georgia, the proportion may be carried to 1 to every 10 electors. It must unavoidably far exceed the proportion in any of the other states. Another general remark to be made is that the ratio between the representatives and the people ought not to be the same where the latter are very numerous as where they are very few. Were the representatives in Virginia to be regulated by the standard in Rhode Island, they would, at this time, amount to between 400 and 500, and 20 or 30 years hence to 1,000. On the other hand, the ratio of Pennsylvania, if applied to the state of Delaware, would reduce the representative assembly of the latter to 7 or 8 members. Nothing can be more fallacious than to found our political calculations on arithmetical principles. 60 or 70 men may be more properly trusted with a given degree of power than 6 or 7. But it does not follow that 600 or 700 would be proportionably a better depositary. And if we carry on the supposition to 6,000 or 7,000, the whole reasoning ought to be reversed. The truth is that in all cases, a certain number at least seems to be necessary to secure the benefits of free consultation and discussion, and to guard against too easy a combination for improper purposes, as, on the other hand, the number ought at most to be kept within a certain limit, in order to avoid the confusion and intemperance of a multitude. In all very numerous assemblies, of whatever character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. It is necessary also to recollect here the observations which were applied to the case of biennial elections, for the same reason that the limited powers of the Congress and the control of the state legislatures justify less frequent elections than the public safely might otherwise require. The members of the Congress need be less numerous than if they possessed the whole power of legislation, and were under no other than the ordinary restraints of other legislative bodies. With these general ideas in our mind, let us weigh the objections which have been stated against the number of members proposed for the House of Representatives. It is said, in the first place, that so small a number cannot be safely trusted with so much power. The number of which this branch of the legislature is to consist at the outset of the government will be 65. Within 3 years, a census is to be taken, when the number may be augmented to 1 for every 30,000 inhabitants, and within every successive period of 10 years, the census is to be renewed, and augmentations may continue to be made under the above limitation. It will not be thought an extravagant conjecture that the first census will, at the rate for 1 of every 30,000, raise the number of representatives to at least 100. Estimating the Negroes in the proportion of 3/5, it can scarcely be doubted that the population of the United States will by that time, if it does not already, amount to 3 millions. At the expiration of 25 years, according to the computed rate of increase, the number of representatives will amount to 200, and of 50 years to 400. This is a number which, I presume, will put an end to all fears arising from the smallness of the body. I take for granted here what I shall, in answering the fourth objection, hereafter show that the number of representatives will be augmented from time to time in the manner provided by the Constitution. On a contrary supposition, I should admit the objection to have very great weight indeed. The true question to be decided then is, whether the smallness of the number as a temporary regulation be dangerous to the public liberty, whether 65 members for a few years and 100 or 200 for a few more be a safe depositary for a limited and well-guarded power of legislating for the United States. I must own that I could not give a negative answer to this question, without first obliterating every impression which I have received with regard to the present genius of the people of America, the spirit which actuates the state legislatures, and the principles which are incorporated with the political character of every class of citizens. I am unable to conceive that the people of America, in their present temper, or under any circumstances which can speedily happen, will choose, and every second year repeat the choice of 65 or 100 men who would be disposed to form and pursue a scheme of tyranny or treachery. I am unable to conceive that the state legislatures, which must feel so many motives to watch, and which possess so many means of counteracting the federal legislature, would fail either to detect or to defeat a conspiracy of the latter against the liberties of their common constituents. I am equally unable to conceive that there are at this time, or can be in any short time in the United States, any 65 or 100 men capable of recommending themselves to the choice of the people at large, who would either desire or dare, within the short space of 2 years, to betray the solemn trust committed to them. What change of circumstances, time, and a fuller population of our country may produce requires a prophetic spirit to declare, which makes no part of my pretensions. But judging from the circumstances now before us, and from the probable state of them within a moderate period of time, I must pronounce that the liberties of America cannot be unsafe in the number of hands proposed by the federal Constitution. From what quarter can the danger proceed? Are we afraid of foreign gold? If foreign gold could so easily corrupt our federal rulers and enable them to ensnare and betray their constituents, how has it happened that we are at this time a free and independent nation? The Congress which conducted us through the Revolution was a less numerous body than their successors will be. They were not chosen by nor responsible to their fellow citizens at large. Though appointed from year to year and recallable at pleasure, they were generally continued for 3 years, and prior to the ratification of the federal articles for a still longer term. They held their consultations always under the veil of secrecy. They had the sole transaction of our affairs with foreign nations, Through the whole course of the war, they had the fate of their country more in their hands than it is to be hoped will ever be the case with our future representatives. And from the greatness of the prize at stake, and the eagerness of the party which lost it, may well be supposed that the use of other means than force would not have been scrupled. Yet we know by happy experience that the public trust was not betrayed, nor has the purity of our public councils in this particular ever suffered, even from the whispers of calumny. Is the danger apprehended from the other branches of the federal government? But where are the means to be found by the President or the Senate or both? Their emoluments of office, it is to be presumed, will not, and without a previous corruption of the House of Representatives, cannot, more than suffice for very different purposes. Their private fortunes, as they must all be American citizens, cannot possibly be sources of danger. The only means, then, which they can possess will be in the dispensation of appointments. Is it here that suspicion rests her charge? Sometimes we are told that this fund of corruption is to be exhausted by the President in subduing the virtue of the Senate. Now the fidelity of the other house is to be the victim. The improbability of such a mercenary and perfidious combination of the several members of government, standing on as different foundations as Republican principles will well admit, and at the same time accountable to the society over which they are placed, ought alone to quiet this apprehension. But fortunately, the Constitution has provided a still further safeguard. The members of the Congress are rendered ineligible to any civil offices that may be created, or of which the emoluments may be increased during the term of their election. No offices, therefore, can be dealt out to the existing members, but such as may become vacant by ordinary casualties. And to suppose that these would be sufficient to purchase the guardians of the people, selected by the people themselves, is to renounce every rule by which events ought to be calculated, and to substitute an indiscriminate and unbounded jealousy, with which all reasoning must be vain. The sincere friends of liberty, who give themselves up to the extravagancies of this passion, are not aware of the injury they do their own cause. As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousy of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another. Publius. So, I wasn't able to control myself, I guess. I don't know, just all this stuff that he's like, oh, it's not going to happen. It's happening now. So it's just it's not really funny when you think about it, but it is kind of silly. I mean, he does say, I'm not a prophet or whatever, but yeah, it didn't work out like he said it would. At least, not 200 years later. I wonder what it would look like if we still had one for every 30,000. We have like 350 million people right now. I got my trusty Windows calculator divided by 30,000. Man, we could have 11,600 members of Congress right now. Wouldn't that be dope? Man, that would be something. That's for sure. All right. Federalist number 56, the same subject continued. The total number of the House of Representatives. For the Independent Journal, Saturday, February 16th, 1788. And this is still James Madison. To the people of the state of New York, the second charge against the House of Representatives is that it will be too small to possess a due knowledge of the interests of its constituents. As this objection evidently proceeds from a comparison of the proposed number of representatives with the great extent of the United States, the number of their inhabitants, and the diversity of their interests, without taking into view the without taking into view at the same time the circumstances which will distinguish the Congress from other legislative bodies, the best answer that can be given to it will be a brief explanation of these peculiarities. It is a sound and important principle that the representative ought to be acquainted with the interests and circumstances of his constituents, but this principle can extend no further than to those circumstances and interests to which the authority and care of the representative relate. An ignorance of a variety of minute and particular objects which do not lie within the compass of legislation is consistent with every attribute necessary to a due performance of the legislative trust. In determining the extent of information required in the exercise of a particular authority, recourse must then be had to the objects within the purview of that authority. What are to be the objects of federal legislation? Those which are of most importance, and which seem most to require local knowledge, are commerce, taxation, and the militia. A proper regulation of commerce requires much information, as has been elsewhere remarked. But as far as this information relates to the laws and local situation of each individual state, a very few representatives would be very sufficient vehicles of it to the federal councils. Taxation will consist in a great measure of duties which will be involved in the regulation of commerce. So far, the preceding remark is applicable to this object. As far as it may consist of internal collections, a more diffusive knowledge of the circumstances of the state may be necessary, but will not this also be possessed in sufficient degree by a very few intelligent men, diffusively elected within the state? Divide the largest state into 10 or 12 districts, and it will found that there will be no peculiar local interests in either, which will not be within the knowledge of the representative of the district. Besides this source of information, the laws of the state, framed by representatives from every part of it, will be almost of themselves a sufficient guide. In every state, there have been made and must continue to be made regulations on this subject which will, in many cases, leave little more to be done by the federal legislature than to review the different laws and reduce them in one general act. A skillful individual in his closet, with all the local codes before him, might compile a law on some subjects of taxation for the whole Union, without any aid from oral information. It may be expected that whenever internal taxes may be necessary, and particularly in cases requiring uniformity throughout the states, the more simple objects will be preferred. To be fully sensible of the facility which will be given to this branch of federal legislation by the assistance of the state codes, we need only suppose for a moment that this or any other state were divided into a number of parts, each having and exercising within itself a power of local legislation. It is not evident that a degree of local information and preparatory labor would be found in the several volumes of their proceedings, which would very much shorten the labors of the general legislature, and render a much smaller number of members sufficient for it. The federal councils will derive great advantage from another circumstance. The representatives of each state will not only bring with them a considerable knowledge of its laws and a local knowledge of their respective districts, but will probably in all cases have been members, and may even at the very time be members of the state legislature, where all the local information and interests of the state are assembled, and from whence they may easily be conveyed by a very few hands into the legislature of the United States. The observations made on the subject of taxation apply with greater force to the case of the militia, for however different the rules of discipline may be in different states, they are the same throughout each particular state, and depend on circumstances which can differ but little in different parts of the same state. I don't know what E1 means. Is there a note at the bottom? Let me just highlight this. No, two versions of this paragraph appear in different editions. Okay, I'm going to read both of them. With regard to the regulation of the militia, there are scarcely any circumstances in reference to which local knowledge can be said to be necessary. The general face of this country, whether mountainous or level, most fit for the operations of infantry or cavalry, is almost the only consideration of this nature that can occur. The art of war teaches general principles of organization, movement, and discipline, which apply universally. The attentive reader will discern that the reasoning here used to prove the sufficiency of a moderate number of representatives does not in any respect contradict what was urged on another occasion with regard to the extensive information which the representatives ought to possess and the time that might be necessary for acquiring it. This information, so far as it may relate to local objects, is rendered necessary and difficult, not by a difference of laws and local circumstances within a single state, but of those among different states. Taking each state by itself, its laws are the same, and its interests but little diversified. A few men, therefore, will possess all the knowledge requisite for a proper representation of them. Were the interests and affairs of each individual state perfectly simple and uniform, a knowledge of them in one part would involve a knowledge of them in every other, and the whole state might be competently represented by a single member taken from any part of it. On a comparison of the different states together, we find a great dissimilarity in their laws and many other circumstances connected with the objects of federal legislation, with all of which the federal representatives ought to have some acquaintance. While a few representatives, therefore, from each state may bring with them a due knowledge of their own state, every representative will have much information to acquire concerning all the other states. The changes of time, as was formerly remarked on the comparative situation of the different states, will have an assimilating effect. The effect of time on the internal affairs of the states, taken singly, will be just the contrary. At present, some of the states are little more than a society of husbandmen. Few of them have made much progress in those branches of industry which give a variety and complexity to the affairs of a nation. These, however, will in all of them be the fruits of a more advanced population, and will require, on the part of each state, a fuller representation. The foresight of the convention has accordingly taken care that the progress of population may be accompanied with a proper increase of the representative branch of the government. The experience of Great Britain, which represents to mankind so many political lessons, both of the monitory and exemplary kind, and which has been frequently consulted in the course of these inquiries, corroborates the result of the reflections which we have just made. The number of inhabitants in the two kingdoms of England and Scotland cannot be stated at less than 8 millions. The representatives of these 8 millions in the House of Commons amount to 558. Of this number, 1/9 are elected by 364 persons, and 1/2 by 5,723 persons. It cannot be supposed that the half thus elected, and who do not even reside among the people at large, can add anything either to the security of the people against the government or to the knowledge of their circumstances and interests in the legislative councils. On the contrary, it is notorious that they are more frequently the representatives and instruments of the executive magistrate than the guardians and advocates of the popular rights. They might therefore with great propriety be considered as something more than a mere deduction from the real representatives of the nation. We will, however, consider them in this light alone, and will not extend the deduction to a considerable number of others who do not reside among their constituents, are very faintly connected with them, and have very little particular knowledge of their affairs. With all these concessions, 279 persons only will be the depository of the safety, interest, and happiness of 8 millions. That is to say, there will be one representative only to maintain the rights and explain the situation of 28,670 constituents in an assembly exposed to the whole force of executive influence, and extending its authority to every object of legislation within a nation whose affairs are in the highest degree diversified and complicated. Yet it is very certain not only that a valuable portion of freedom has been preserved under all these circumstances, but that the defects in the British Code are chargeable in a very small proportion on the ignorance of the legislature concerning the circumstances of the people. Allowing this case the weight which is due to it, and comparing it with that of the House of Representatives, as above explained, it seems to give the fullest assurance that a representative for every 30,000 inhabitants will render the latter both a safe and competent guardian of the interests which will be confided to it. Publius. And hello, Hernan. Welcome. Yeah, I saw you come in earlier, but I don't like interrupting the the reading with commentary and stuff. I always save it for later. So up at the beginning, he's kind of talking about how the representatives will actually represent the people. And I think that's something that we've kind of lost. Now we have, what is it? How many people are in the House of Representatives? Like 530 or something? I'll just Google it. Number of people in House of Representatives. 435. All right, I was like 100 off. I think I was thinking of electoral votes. That's 538. Where'd YouTube go? There it is. So we have 435 members of the House, and like 434 are lawyers and one's a bartender. So we don't really have a diversity of people that can accurately represent Americans anymore. They just we have a bunch of lawyers and then someone to make them drinks. I think some of them do have different professions that they come from. I'm not totally sure. I think Ron Paul was like a doctor or something, like a surgeon or a physician. Yeah, he's not in anymore, but he was. So yeah, he talks about kind of how that'll be laid out, and you compare that to other systems like corporatism, which people are scared of the term because they're like, ooh, that sounds like corporation. But it's basically just like a return to kind of the old feudal system, but on a larger scale, where representatives from industry have some say in like government policy regarding that that industry. So that kind of sprouted from Alexander Hamilton's economic system, but they're not, obviously we weren't corporatist, but it was influenced by that. With Friedrich List, he was influenced by Hamilton, and then Othmar Spann, who was kind of like the godfather of fascist economics. He was influenced by Friedrich List, so there's definitely like a lineage there. And you could say we are corporatists today if you want, because what's the lobby? At least the corporatist system incorporates these things on like an official, in an official capacity, and then lobbying is just like it's not a bribe, but it's a bribe. See how much longer are these two? I feel like we're going through pretty quick. I don't know. Maybe I cut this short on purpose. I'm just checking. Okay, yeah, if we go to 59 through 61, I'll cover the same subject. So, yeah, we'll stop after 58. Let's see this one. Yeah, these are both 5 pages, so they're at a normal length. I'm going to see if my tea is cold enough to drink. The answer is no. It is not cold enough to drink. All right, number 57. The alleged tendency of the new plan to elevate the few at the expense of the many considered in connection with representation. From the New York Packet, Tuesday, February 19th, 1788. James Madison. To the people of the state of New York. The third charge against the House of Representatives is that it will be taken from that class of citizens which will have least sympathy with the mass of the people, and be most likely to aim at an ambitious sacrifice of the many to the aggrandizement of the few. Of all the objections which have been framed against the federal constitution, this is perhaps the most extraordinary. Whilst the objection itself is leveled against a pretended oligarchy, the principle of it strikes at the very root of republican government. The aim of every political constitution is, or ought to be, first to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern, and most virtue to pursue the common good of the society, and in the next place to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous, whilst they continue to hold their public trust. The elective mode of obtaining rulers is the characteristic policy of republican government. The means relied on in this form of government for preventing their degeneracy are numerous and various. The most effectual one is such a limitation of the term of appointments as will maintain a proper responsibility to the people. Let me ask now what circumstance there is in the Constitution of the House of Representatives that violates the principles of republican government or favors the elevation of the few on the ruins of the many. Let me ask whether every circumstance is not, on the contrary, strictly conformable to these principles and scrupulously impartial to the rights and pretensions of every class and description of citizens. Who are to be the electors of the federal representatives? Not the rich more than the poor, not the learned more than the ignorant, not the haughty heirs of distinguished names more than the humble sons of obscurity and unpropitious fortune. The electors are to be the great body of the people of the United States. They are to be the same who exercise the right in every state of electing the corresponding branch of the legislature of the state. Who are to be the objects of popular choice? Every citizen whose merit may recommend him to the esteem and confidence of his country. No qualification of wealth, of birth, of religious faith, or of civil profession is permitted to fetter the judgment or disappoint the inclination of the people. If we consider the situation of the men on whom the free suffrages of their fellow citizens may confer the representative trust, we shall find it involving every security which can be devised or desired for their fidelity to their constituents. In the first place, as they will have been distinguished by the preference of their fellow citizens, we are to presume that in general they will be somewhat distinguished also by those qualities which entitle them to it, and which promise a sincere and scrupulous regard to the nature of their engagements. In the second place, they will enter into the public service under circumstances which cannot fail to produce a temporary affection, at least to their constituents. There is in every breast a sensibility to marks of honor, of favor, of esteem, and of confidence, which, apart from all considerations of interest, is some pledge for grateful and benevolent returns. Ingratitude is a common topic of declamation against human nature, and it must be confessed that instances of it are but too frequent and flagrant, both in public and private life. But the universal and extreme indignation which it inspires is itself a proof of the energy and prevalence of the contrary sentiment. In the third place, those ties which bind the representative to his constituents are strengthened by motives of a more selfish nature. His pride and vanity attach him to a form of government which favors his pretensions and gives him a share in its honors and distinctions. Whatever hopes or projects might be entertained by a few aspiring characters, it must generally happen that a great proportion of the men deriving their advancement from the influence with the people would have more to hope from a preservation of the favor than from innovations in the government subversive to the authority of the people. All these securities, however, would be found very insufficient without the restraint of frequent elections. Hence, in the fourth place, the House of Representatives is so constituted as to support in the members an habitual recollection of their dependence on the people, before the sentiments impressed on their minds by the mode of their elevation can be effaced by the exercise of power. They will be compelled to anticipate the moment when their power is to cease, when their exercise of it is to be reviewed, and when they must descend to the level from which they were raised. They are forever to remain, unless a faithful discharge of their trust shall have established their title to a renewal of it. I will add, as a fifth circumstance in the situation of the House of Representatives, restraining them from oppressive measures, that they can make no law which will not have its full operation on themselves and their friends, as well as on the great mass of society. This has always been deemed one of the strongest bonds by which human policy can connect the rulers and the people together. It creates between them that communion of interest and sympathy of sentiments, of which few governments have furnished examples, but without which every government degenerates into tyranny. If it be asked what is to restrain the House of Representatives from making legal discriminations in favor of themselves and a particular class of society, I answer, the genius of the whole system, the nature of just and constitutional laws, and above all, the vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the people of America, a spirit which nourishes freedom and in return is nourished by it. If this spirit shall ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislature as well as on the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. Such will be the relation between the House of Representatives and their constituents. Duty, gratitude, interest, ambition itself are the cords by which they will be bound to fidelity and sympathy with the great mass of the people. It is possible that these may all be insufficient to control the caprice and wickedness of man, but are they not all that government will admit and that human prudence can devise? Are they not the genuine and the characteristic means by which republican government provides for the liberty and happiness of the people? Are they not the identical means on which every state government in the Union relies for the attainment of these important ends? What then are we to understand by the objection which this paper has combated? What are we to say to the men who profess the most flaming zeal for republican government, yet boldly impeach the fundamental principle of it, who pretend to be champions for the right and the capacity of the people to choose their own rulers, yet maintain that they will prefer those only who will immediately and infallibly betray the trust committed to them? Were the objection to be read by one who had not seen the mode prescribed by the Constitution for the choice of representatives, he could suppose nothing less than that some unreasonable qualification of property was annexed to the right of suffrage, or that the right of eligibility was limited to persons or particular families or fortunes, or at least that the mode prescribed by the state constitutions was in some respect or other very grossly departed from. We have seen how far such a supposition would err. As to the first 2 points, nor would it, in fact, be less erroneous as to the last. The only difference discoverable between the two cases is that each representative of the United States will be elected by 5,000 or 6,000 citizens, whilst in the individual states the election of a representative is left to about as many hundreds. Will it be pretended that this difference is sufficient to justify an attachment to the state governments and an abhorrence to the federal government? If this be the point on which the objection turns, it deserves to be examined. Is it supported by reason? This cannot be said without maintaining that 5,000 or 6,000 citizens are less capable of choosing a fit representative or more liable to be corrupted by an unfit one than 500 or 600. Reason, on the contrary, assures us that as in so great a number a fit representative would be most likely to be found, so the choice would be less likely to be diverted from him by the intrigues of the ambitious or the bribes of the rich. That might be a typo. Is the consequence from this doctrine admissible? If we say that 500 or 600 citizens are as many as can jointly exercise the right of suffrage, must we not deprive the people of the immediate choice of their public servants in every instance where the administration of the government does not require as many of them as will amount to one for that number of citizens? Is the doctrine warranted by facts? It was shown in the last paper that the real representation in the British House of Commons very little exceeds the proportion of 1 for every 30,000 inhabitants. Besides a variety of powerful causes not existing here, in which favor in that country the pretensions of rank and wealth, no person is eligible as a representative of a county, unless he possess real estate of the clear value of £600 sterling per year, nor of a city or a borough, unless he possess a like estate of half that annual value. To this qualification on the part of the county representatives is added another on the part of the county electors, which restrains the right of suffrage to persons having a freehold estate of the annual value of more than £20 sterling, according to the present rate of money. Notwithstanding these unfavorable circumstances, and notwithstanding some very unequal laws in the British Code, it cannot be said that the representatives of the nation have elevated the few on the ruins of the many. But we need not resort to foreign experience on this subject. Our own is explicit and decisive. The districts in New Hampshire in which the senators are chosen immediately by the people are nearly as large as will be necessary for her representatives in the Congress. Those of Massachusetts are larger than will be necessary for that purpose, and those of New York still more so. In the last state, the members of Assembly for the cities and counties of New York and Albany are elected by very nearly as many voters as will be entitled to a representative in the Congress, calculating on the number of 65 representatives only. It makes no difference that in these senatorial districts and counties a number of representatives are voted for by each elector at the same time. If the same electors at the same time are capable of choosing 4 or 5 representatives, they cannot be incapable of choosing one. Pennsylvania is an additional example. Some of her counties, which elect her state representatives, are almost as large as her districts will be, by which her federal representatives will be elected. The city of Philadelphia is supposed to contain between 50 and 60,000 souls. It will therefore form nearly 2 districts for the choice of federal representatives. It forms, however, but one county, in which every elector votes for each of its representatives in the state legislature. In what may appear to be still more directly to our purpose, the whole city actually elects a single member for the executive council. This is the case in all the other counties of the state. Are not these facts the most satisfactory proofs of the fallacy which has been employed against the branch of the federal government under consideration? Has it appeared on trial that the senators of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and New York, or the Executive Council of Pennsylvania, or the members of the Assembly in the last 2 states have betrayed any peculiar disposition to sacrifice the many to the few, or are in any respect less worthy of their places than the representatives and magistrates appointed in other states by very small divisions of the people? But there are cases of a stronger complexion than any which I have yet quoted. One branch of the legislature of Connecticut is so constituted that each member of it is elected by the whole state. So is the governor of that state, of Massachusetts, and of this state, and the president of New Hampshire. I leave every man to decide whether the result of any one of these experiments can be said to countenance a suspicion that a diffusive mode of choosing representatives of the people tends to elevate traitors and to undermine the public liberty. Publius. So really, he says it all at the beginning. I'm going to see if my tea is cold yet. It's not. I'm not used to speaking, so reading out loud for an hour always does a number on my throat. So yeah, I mean, it's really all in this first paragraph, and I think he's wrong. So, I mean, I think it's obvious by now. I'm not really a fan of Congress or representative democracy in general. So, I don't think our current representatives represent the people, and they definitely come from a different class of citizens here. They're very disconnected with regular people, and we basically are an oligarchy at this point. So, at the time, maybe things were better, but the last few articles have just been like, well, that's not true anymore. All these things you said wouldn't happen ended up happening. And I'm sure it was kind of true at the time also, but it's even more true now. a normal person isn't going to become a representative. You're just not going to, there's no way you can just put yourself out there and get, thousands of people to vote for you, or millions. So it's really just whoever they're willing to put in front of the TV. And I mean, at the time, that was probably also true with newspapers. Maybe in some smaller communities, a person could kind of campaign on their own. But I'm sure newspapers had a large sway in who got elected, whether they truly represented the interests of the people or not. And this is 58. So let's see. Yeah, that's not too bad. Just enjoy some more tea for now. Slowly. All right, this is number 58. Objection that the number of members will not be augmented as the progress of population demands. Considered for the Independent Journal, Wednesday, February 20th, 1788. James Madison. To the people of the state of New York, the remaining charge against the House of Representatives, which I am to examine, is grounded on a supposition that the number of members will not be augmented from time to time, as the progress of population may demand. It has been admitted that this objection, if well supported, would have great weight. The following observations will show that, like most other objections against the Constitution, it can only proceed from a partial view of the subject, or from a jealousy which discolors and disfigures every object which is beheld. 1. Those who urge the objection seem not to have recollected that the federal Constitution will not suffer by a comparison with the state constitutions, in the security provided for a gradual augmentation of the number of representatives. The number which is to prevail in the first instance is declared to be temporary. Its duration is limited to the short term of 3 years. With every successive term of 10 years, a census of inhabitants is to be repeated. The unequivocal objects of these regulations are, first, to readjust from time to time the apportionment of representatives to the number of inhabitants, under the single exception that each state shall have one representative at least. Secondly, to augment the number of representatives at the same periods under the sole limitation that the whole number shall not exceed one for every 30,000 inhabitants. If we review the constitutions of the several states, we shall find that some of them contain no determinate regulations on the subject, that others correspond pretty much on this point with the federal constitution, and that the most effectual security in any of them is resolvable into a mere directory provision. As far as experience has taken place on this subject, a gradual increase of representatives under the state constitutions has at least kept pace with that of the constituents, and it appears that the former have been as ready to concur in such measures as the latter have been to call for them. There is a peculiarity in the federal constitution which ensures a watchful attention in a majority both of the people and of their representatives to a constitutional augmentation of the latter. This peculiarity lies in this, that one branch of the legislature is a representative of citizens, the other of the states, and the former, consequently, the larger states will have most weight. In the latter, the advantage will be in favor of the smaller states. From this circumstance, it may with certainty be inferred that the larger states will be strenuous advocates for increasing the number and weight of that part of the legislature in which their influence predominates. And it so happens that 4 only of the largest will have a majority of the whole votes in the House of Representatives. Should the representatives or people, therefore, of the smaller states oppose at any time a reasonable addition of members, a coalition of a very few states will be sufficient to overrule the opposition. A coalition which, notwithstanding the rivalship and local prejudices which might prevent it on ordinary occasions, would not fail to take place, when not merely prompted by common interests, but justified by equity and the principles of the Constitution. It may be alleged, perhaps, that the Senate would be prompted by like motives to an adverse coalition, and as their concurrence would be indispensable, the just and constitutional views of the other branch might be defeated. This is the difficulty which has probably created the most serious apprehensions in the jealous friends of a numerous representation. Fortunately, it is among the difficulties which, existing only in appearance, vanish on a close and accurate inspection. The following reflections will, if I mistake not, be admitted to be conclusive and satisfactory on this point. Notwithstanding the equal authority which will subsist between the two houses on all legislative subjects, except the originating of money bills, it cannot be doubted that the House, composed of the greater number of members, when supported by the more powerful states and speaking the known and determined sense of a majority of the people, will have no small advantage in a question depending on the comparative firmness of the two houses. This advantage must be increased by the consciousness felt by the same side of being supported in its demands by right, by reason, and by the Constitution, and the consciousness on the opposite side of contending against the force of all these solemn considerations. It is farther to be considered that in the gradation between the smallest and largest states, there are several which, though most likely in general to arrange themselves among the former, are too little removed in extent and population from the latter, to second in opposition to their just and legitimate pretensions. Hence, it is by no means certain that a majority of votes, even in the Senate, would be unfriendly to proper augmentations in the number of representatives. It will not be looking too far to add that the senators from all the new states may be gained over to the just views of the House of Representatives by an expedient too obvious to be overlooked, as these states will, for a great length of time, advance in population with peculiar rapidity. They will be interested in frequent reapportionments of the representatives to the number of inhabitants. The large states, therefore, who will prevail in the House of Representatives will have nothing to do but to make reapportionments and augmentations mutually conditions of each other, and the senators from all the most growing states will be bound to contend for the latter, by the interest which their states will feel in the former. These considerations seem to afford ample security on the subject, and not alone to satisfy all the doubts and fears which have been indulged with regard to it, admitting, however, that they should all be insufficient to subdue the unjust policy of the smaller states, or their predominant influence in the councils of the Senate. A constitutional and infallible resource still remains with the larger states, by which they will be able at all times to accomplish their just purposes. The House of Representatives cannot only refuse, but they alone can propose the supplies requisite for the support of government. They, in a word, hold the purse, that powerful instrument by which we behold, in the history of the British Constitution, an infant and humble representation of the people, gradually enlarging the sphere of its activity and importance, and finally reducing, as far as it seems to have wished, all the overgrown prerogatives of the other branches of the government. This power over the purse may, in fact, be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. But will not the House of Representatives be as much interested as the Senate in maintaining the government in its proper functions, and will they not therefore be unwilling to stake its existence or its reputation on the pliancy of the Senate? Or, if such a trial of firmness between the two branches were hazarded, would not the one be as likely first to yield as the other? These questions will create no difficulty with those who reflect that in all cases, the smaller the number, the more permanent and conspicuous the nation, or the station, of men in power. The stronger must be the interest which they will individually feel in whatever concerns the government. Those who represent the dignity of their country in the eyes of other nations will be particularly sensible to every prospect of public danger, or of dishonorable stagnation in public affairs. To those causes we are to ascribe the continual triumph of the British House of Commons over the other branches of the government, whenever the engine of a money bill has been employed. An absolute inflexibility on the side of the latter, although it could not have failed to involve every department of the state in the general confusion, has neither been apprehended nor experienced. The utmost degree of firmness that can be displayed by the Federal Senate or President will not be more than equal to a resistance in which they will be supported by constitutional and patriotic principles. In this review of the Constitution of the House of Representatives, I have passed over the circumstances of economy which, in the present state of affairs, might have had some effect in lessening the temporary number of representatives, and in disregard of which would probably have been as rich a theme of declamation against the Constitution as had been shown by the smallness of the number proposed. I omit also any remarks on the difficulty which might be found under present circumstances in engaging in the federal service a large number of such characters as the people will probably elect. One observation, however, I must be permitted to add on this subject, as claiming, in my judgment, a very serious attention. It is that in all legislative assemblies, the greater the number composing them may be, the fewer will be the men who will in fact direct their proceedings. In the first place, the more numerous an assembly may be, of whatever character is composed, the greater is known to be the ascendancy of passion over reason. In the next place, the larger the number, the greater will be the proportion of members of limited information and of weak capacities. Now it is precisely on characters of this description that the eloquence and address of the few are known to act with all their force. In the ancient republics, where the whole body of the people was assembled in person, a single orator or an artful statesman was generally seen to rule with as complete a sway as if a scepter had been placed in his single hand. On the same principle, the more multitudinous a representative assembly may be rendered, the more it will partake of the infirmities incident to collective meetings of the people. Ignorance will be the dupe of cunning, and passion the slave of sophistry and declamation. The people can never err more than in supposing that by multiplying their representatives beyond a certain limit, they strengthen the barrier against the government of a few. Experience will forever admonish them that, on the contrary, after securing a sufficient number for the purposes of safety, of local information, and of diffusive sympathy with the whole society, they will counteract their own views by every addition to their representatives. The countenance of the government may become more democratic, but the soul that animates it will be more oligarchic. The machine will be enlarged, but the fewer, and often the more secret, will be the springs by which its motions are directed. As connected with the objection against the number of representatives may properly be here noticed that which has been suggested against the number made competent for legislative business. It has been said that more than a majority ought to have been required for a quorum, and in particular cases, if not at all, more than a majority of a quorum for a decision. That some advantages might have resulted from such a precaution cannot be denied. It might have been an additional shield to some particular interests. I'll just start that again. It might have been an additional shield to some particular interests and another obstacle generally to hasty and partial measures. But these considerations are outweighed by the inconveniences in the opposite scale. In all cases where justice or the general good might require new laws to be passed or active measures to be pursued, the fundamental principle of free government would be reversed. It would be no longer the majority that would rule. The power would be transferred to the minority. Where the defensive privilege limited to particular cases, an interested minority might take advantage of it to screen themselves from equitable sacrifices to the general weal, or, in particular emergencies, to extort unreasonable indulgences. Lastly, it would facilitate and foster the baneful practice of secessions, a practice which has shown itself even in states where a majority only is required, a practice subversive of all the principles of order and regular government, a practice which leads more directly to public convulsions and the ruin of popular governments than any other which has yet been displayed among us. Publius. Oh, you said among us. Oh, sus. Sus among us. uh, so yeah, I guess the 11,000 member Congress is out the window, you know. No fun allowed. Would be funny to have Congress have to build like a football stadium and meet in that, but 435, that's already too many. We don't even need a Congress. That's already too many. And let's see. Number 59 is going to be about the power of Congress to elect members, and then 60 is the same thing. So we're not gonna do both of those. So we'll stop here, and then we'll start getting into the Senate, I think. Yeah. So yeah, that'll probably be next time. All right, 59. And let me just look at my hard copy, see how many pages we read today. And move my bookmark. Let's see, we started on 267 and ended on 289, so... Oh wait, no, we started on 266. So, yeah, 23 pages. It's not too bad, not too bad. And we'll see where how long these other ones are. Because a lot of these are kind of, the same subject continued for the next few, so I don't want to just leave off in the middle of a topic. So I have to plan accordingly. So let's see, 59, 60, and 61 are all the same thing. And 62 and 63 are the Senate. That takes us to page 307. That's less than 20 pages. I try to do at least 20. Oh wait, no, that ends on 314. Never mind. So yeah, 59 through 63 next time should be good for us. That'll be about 25 pages. So we'll introduce the Senate. We'll finish with the House of Representatives, introduce the Senate. It's going to be a good week, I'll tell you. Definitely feels like we're kind of on the home stretch. I mean, there's still over 100 pages to read here. I think we have about 150 left. Yeah. But, it's a decent sized book, and we're just going through it a little bit at a time. So that's all we need to do. There's no rush. But we should be able to finish this year. As long as I keep being consistent doing this on Saturday. We'll probably be able to finish like next month. So yeah, that's it for today. And I won't be streaming tomorrow. So Friday, I'll be finishing up Momodora, Reverie Under the Moonlight. And then on Saturday, we'll pick up with this and finish our discussion of the House of Representatives and start our discussion on the Senate. So that's pretty exciting. So thank you, Hernan, and anyone who is lurking for being with me again today. And I'll see you all next week on Friday. Bye.